If, like me, you're a writer with big dreams and ambitions and a modicum of talent, you've been working on it for a while, but you don't have any kind of industry connection. You don't have a best friend who works for HarperCollins. You don't have a family friend who golfs with Steven Spielberg. Then it may seem like your best chance for breaking into the industry is a writing contest. And there's a lot of success stories that have come out of writing contests. There are a lot of writers who have gotten their first manager or agent or sold a screenplay as a result of the attention they got from winning or even placing as a finalist in a contest. But something to keep in mind, there are some harsh truths that a lot of writers need to hear before they before coughing up those submission fees. First off, if you don't know me, my name's Josh. I have 3 degrees in film. I have worked in the film industry a bit. These days, I mostly work as a screenplay consultant. Since the year 2020, I've been reading professionally for a number of screenplay contests. At this point, I've probably read something like 1,500 unproduced screenplays in every form and genre. And today what I'd like to do for you is share with you the most common notes I give writers. But before getting into the nitty-gritty, I want to speak a bit more generally about writing contests. The first thing to understand is that the vast majority of screenplays submitted to these contests will not place. Even scripts that are really well written and extremely original may not place, and that simply has to do with the type of screenplay that does well in contests. Now, I can think of many movies that I adore that have screenplays that just would simply not win a contest. Movies by Quentin Tarantino or by Wes Anderson, Christopher Nolan, Stanley Kubrick, Andrei Tarkovsky, Akira Kurosawa, Hayao Miyazaki. These scripts are not contest winners. That has nothing to do with the quality of the script or the beauty of the artistic imagination behind them. It simply has to do with what screenplay readers are looking for and what we can sort of judge in a more or less objective sense. A contest-winning script needs to be at least somewhat conventional in its structure, focusing on psychologically rich characters who hopefully have some kind of arc across the span of the script, who are facing a well-defined main conflict. They're always within conventional length, they're always conventionally formatted, and they, more often than not, explicitly engage with timely or relevant themes that are popular in the zeitgeist at the moment. Now, if you're writing something that's way outside of the box on any of these points, then I might actually suggest that you shelve that one for now, that you save it for another day, and that now you do the hard work of rolling up your sleeves, coming up with a new idea for something that is a little more conventional. And if this suggestion frustrates you, if you find yourself mad at me right now for saying this to you, that is all the more reason to do it. Because it means you're really going to be pushing yourself outside of your comfort zone and trying something new. And I guarantee you, the worst case scenario of doing this would be that you would grow as a writer and you'd learn a lot about yourself and the type of material you want to write. Another thing to keep in mind is that readers at these contests read a lot of scripts. Many of them are professional readers who are working at agencies or production companies, and they read scripts for a living even outside of the contest. Many of them have read way more scripts than I have, thousands and thousands of scripts. So what does that mean? It means that we've seen it all before. Most readers are not going to be as blown away by your subversion of conventions as you might think. But what readers will be blown away by is your ability to make us care about and attach ourselves emotionally to a character. That never gets old. Readers love that. Okay, but even if your script is at least moderately conventional, most scripts still need a lot of work. Even if your script is very good is not good enough to win a contest. You are up against thousands of other writers. You need your material to be undeniably good. Let me share a pattern with you that I've noticed, and I bet other readers have noticed the same pattern. There are basically three types of writers who submit to contests. One, there's the writers who submit in the first week or two of the contest opening. And what that tells us right away is that this writer has been planning ahead. They know when the contest is opening. They have planned to have their script ready in time for the opening. They've been working on it, they've decided it's ready, and they submit it. Number two, there are the writers who submit in the last week or two of the contest. Now, these writers have probably been working and reworking their script up until the last minute. These writers understand that things can always get better, and they're not going to waste submitting to a contest before the deadline if they have all that time to work on it. Number three are the writers who submit somewhere in the middle of the contest. Now, this is obviously a generalization, but often it's the case that a writer finishes their script and they're so elated and so excited, and maybe they get a trusted friend to read it. They quickly make a few changes, maybe get someone to proofread it, and then they just open up Coverfly and see what contests are currently open and fire it off to a couple places. Now, the scripts from the writers in categories 1 and 2 are almost always better than the scripts from category 3. If you catch yourself finishing your script and maybe after one or two quick revisions wanting to fire it off somewhere, stop yourself. Don't do it. Take a breath. Put it aside. Maybe forget about it for a month or two and come back to it with fresh eyes. Get many people to read it and give you notes. Not one or two people, but as many as you can. Remember, redrafting a script is a really long process. More on that later. But the last point I want to make right now is to temper your expectations. I'm saying that not only because most writers will not place in the contest, but because even writers who do, who get a finalist position or win, may not have their dreams come true right away. Yes, it's good to win a contest. You get prize money. You get the laurels on Coverfly. You get the accolade. It's a feather in your hat. You can go and query some managers and say, hey, look, I won this contest. That's only going to help you. Congratulations. However, I also know a lot of writers who have won or placed finalist in some very prestigious contests and had nothing happen as a result. A lot of it depends on what contest we're talking about too. Something to keep in mind is that not all writing contests are created equal. A good contest will actively promote your material well after the contest is over and use their own network of producers, managers, agents to try to get your career off the ground. But there are a lot of useless contests out there. That doesn't mean they're run by people who have bad intentions or that they're scams, but it just means that the people running them don't have a great network. They can't get your material to people because they don't know those people. Now, I'm not going to name any names here. I'm not going to tell you what contests to avoid. But I will tell you, you can always trust big name contests. Just use your own discernment. So with all that aside, let's get into the nitty-gritty of the most common notes that I give writers as a judge for a writing contest. Note number 1, a humdrum premise. This note I can give even before reading the script. Often I can give it just from the logline itself. Now, as writers, we often forget that the publishing industry and the film industry are industries. The people in these industries who have major, serious, artistic ambitions, they still have to be able to sell and market your materials to an audience. And the way that they do that they sell and market your materials to an audience, is by the concept and the premise, the big picture idea of what your story is about. When you watch a movie trailer or you read the blurb on the back of a book, all you're doing is engaging with the big picture concept and the narrative premise. If your story is not interesting on that level, from a logline or from the blurb on the back of a book, then you're in trouble. Of the 1,500 or so scripts that I've read, I would say maybe half of them are moderately well written. They might have good characters or good plot points or moments that are effective, but their premises or their concepts in general just do not do much. They're not that original. They don't stand out at the level of a pitch, and they're never going to go anywhere, no matter how good the draft becomes. Sometimes the concept might have some interesting elements, but they're not yet like clicking and becoming one concept, one narrative idea. The truth, the hard truth, is that if your script is pretty good, it's not amazing yet, it needs more work, but it's pretty good, but the premise is not bristling with energy and originality, the concept itself is not something that turns heads and makes us go, whoa, I've never seen that before. Or if you don't have conflict baked into the premise itself, if there's no stakes, or there isn't an interesting character in an unlikely situation, then it may not be worth the work of redrafting. In such cases, the really tough advice that writers need to hear is that they either need to make massive, global, big picture changes to the premise itself, which amounts to a page one rewrite often, or they may be better off shelving that script, coming back to it another day, and going back to the hunt for new, unique, original, exciting concepts for stories. This is why I suggest writers work on their log lines first. And for the record, I do have a video about log lines. But the bottom line is that log lines are not just a marketing tool. They are a way for writers to find out for themselves if they have a firm grasp on what their story is about, and if that story is inherently interesting and worth telling. If there are problems in the logline, it's often not a problem with how you've written the logline. Rather, it's a problem with how you've conceived of your story. Note number 2, the first pages do not grab us. Now, this doesn't mean that every script ever needs to open with a big bombastic action scene or a life or death moment. It just means that the opening moments need to honestly and effectively communicate the tone and theme of the work in general. So let's say your story is a slow burn drama with an emphasis on atmosphere. Then I would not suggest you open with some kind of exciting, action-packed moment. I would actually suggest that you open the script with the most atmospheric moment you can come up with. And yet still, in scripts that are a bit slower and quieter, you can still come up with moments where the conflict comes to a boil, where things are heated and tense. So let's say you write a script that's extremely quiet. Maybe it's about Buddhist monks living in a monastery. So it's very monastic. Well, maybe you open your script with a monk immolating himself. But in any case, you have to imagine the script from the reader's perspective. Your reader reads for a living. This is a job to them. If they can get through multiple scripts in a day, they'll be paid more. And if nothing interesting happens in the first page, 2 pages, 10 pages, then they've already made up their mind. Your opening pages, but really your opening page, and honestly, your opening line needs to grab the reader by the scruff of the neck and say, you gotta see this. Most common note number 3, weak plots. In a strong plot, the events are connected in a single chain of cause and effect. Characters take action. They make choices that have irreversible consequences, and it all leads to a culmination where opposing forces resolve in one way or another. But it's easier said than done. So here are some ways that you can weaken your plot. A, weak inciting incident. The inciting incident comes out of nowhere and rips the protagonist out of their ordinary life, forcing them to respond to some kind of main conflict. Now that can be anything. Anything from a meteor that's going to come and destroy the Earth to an annoying friend who has just decided he's going to sleep on your couch for the foreseeable future. The point is that your character is no longer in their comfort zone. Conventional wisdom places this inciting incident somewhere between page 10 and page 20, let's say, of a screenplay, and there's an extremely good reason for doing that. It's so that the majority of your script, which comes after page 10 or page 20, will be a response to that inciting incident. It will unfold the consequences of that inciting incident. This is all basic stuff, right? I mean, if you're watching this video, you've probably heard this before. But so many scripts, and I mean so many scripts, do not have inciting incidents. Or there is an inciting incident, kind of, but the protagonist can more or less just go back to their daily life without things really changing. Sometimes there's like 2 or 3 inciting incidents, and they're like slightly different, but they're kind of nudging the protagonist in a certain direction. Or the worst of all is when there is an inciting incident, and it is a decisive, dramatic moment, like we like, but it comes in the last 10 pages of the script or the last 20 pages of the script, where you don't have time to unfold the consequences of the inciting incident. Now, some of you might think, yeah, that's the point. I'm reinventing the wheel here. I'm doing something different. And honestly, power to you. However, you have to realize you're reinventing the wheel for no reason. Like, the wheel's pretty good. Why are you reinventing it? But moreover, you are forestalling your script from having a legible structure and an emotionally rewarding plot. B, lack of causation. Okay, the inciting incident should come out of nowhere, come out of left field, out of the blue. But after that point, nothing else should come out of the blue. Now, maybe there's some exceptions to this, but for the most part, we want every event that happens after the inciting incident to be the consequence of earlier events. And if there are subplots that are somewhat detached from that main narrative chain of causation, then at some point they need to weave back into it and influence it. Otherwise, the reader feels like, what's the point of this? Why am I reading this? You want to reward your reader for their attention. Reward them for remembering what happens earlier. Put plants that are paid off later. Make choices that happen earlier have unforeseen consequences later. If too much in your script becomes episodic or standalone moments that have their own conflict that arises and then is resolved at the end, and then we kind of go back to something else afterwards. If too much in your script relies on luck, on coincidences, people just happen to be in the same place at the same time, and that drives the plot forward, then you have weak causation. And it connects to the next point, which is the lack of dramatic unity. Why do you begin your story where you do? And why do you end it where you do? Hopefully you have an extremely clear answer to this question before you write your story. Answering that question will probably tell you what the focus of your story is. Some stories have it easier than others by taking place entirely in one day or maybe in one night. Or perhaps your story is focusing upon just one battle in a much larger war. Then you have this sort of temporal framework already built for you. But other stories need a little bit more reflection on what that temporal framework is based on. I'll let you in on a secret. I see so many scripts that begin with the protagonist's childhood, with either a short scene or maybe a sequence, 15 pages, 20 pages, that show how their relationship with their mother fell apart, or how their dad died, or how they were estranged from their sister. 9 times out of 10, we don't need that. We can learn that as we go, through dialogue or through the dynamics between characters. Most stories do not benefit from having the cradle to the grave structure. It's just too much. It's too broad of a temporal framework. This goes for time jumps as well. If you can just jump time 3 weeks or 3 months or 3 years in the middle of your story, then that communicates to your reader that nothing that was going on was very urgent or important, because we can just jump past it and go somewhere else. Why not start the story over there where things get interesting and important and urgent? That's the part we want to see. The next one, D, passive protagonists. There is a pandemic of passivity going on, okay? So many amateur writers will come up with really fascinating events that happen, but then they'll choose for a protagonist a character who's just sort of there as a spectator, witnessing it all. If the problems that are introduced in the first half of your script are solved by characters other than your protagonist in the second half, then you have chosen the wrong character as your protagonist. If your protagonist does not struggle in a deep and personal way with the main conflict, if the main conflict does not mess up their own personal life, and if they're not forced to make really tough decisions where they have to sacrifice something that was important to them, or they have to wrestle with a moral dilemma, then you've chosen the wrong character. The word plot is a verb, not just a noun. You have to plot a story. The story does not plot itself. A plot is not just a bunch of events lined up in a row, and then your character just sort of moves through them. Your character is someone who makes choices that drives those events, that drives the plot forward. And that doesn't mean they're always in command. It doesn't mean that they're consciously making all these events happen. In fact, it's often more interesting if their choices have unforeseen consequences. Or they could go through moments of passivity. They might be taken prisoner, or maybe they're drugged or knocked unconscious, or maybe they just give up for a while. That's A-okay. As long as generally speaking, they are the catalyst that brings the main conflict to a culmination. And this leads to the next point. Most common note I give, number 4, uninteresting characters. The key to a good character is how you introduce them. Write a really good character introduction, and you'll not only reveal to the reader what this character is all about, but you'll reveal it to yourself. And I think something's misunderstood here based on the scripts I'm reading. A lot of writers think that a good character introduction revolves around how they are described. That's not it at all. A character introduction needs to reveal what the character's worldview is, what their values are, what makes them tick in some deeper way, through a choice they make or an action they take. Never reveal a character doing something generic or sitting around and waiting, unless sitting around and waiting somehow truly defines that character. And don't just give me information about the character. Dramatize it. I don't want to see a character driving around in his pickup truck, listening to conservative talk radio, and then go, yeah, I agree with that. That is insanely lazy writing. Instead, have him walk through Skid Row for some reason, and then have a homeless man come up to him with his hat outstretched, asking for change, and have him say, yeah, I got something for you, and then spit in the hat. That will communicate his worldview way more dramatically. Making a character interesting really comes down to 2 things. One is, do they have a unique worldview? Do they have values and a perspective that is well defined? And number 2 is, do they have a motivation? What's their motivation? What do they want? What are they looking for? If we don't get clear answers to both of these questions, and I don't mean through dialogue, don't just have them come out and say it. Reveal it through action, through choices, through drama. If we don't get clear answers to both of those questions, then the character, even if it's a side character, a minor character, will feel vague. And sometimes it's okay to have vague characters. Not every single character needs to be a super deep 3-dimensional character. That's fine. But the main ones should. And this goes double for your protagonist. Too many people pick protagonists that are sort of like generic, and then everyone around them is interesting. Professional readers who read for agencies and production companies, usually the very first question they'll ask about any script that comes their way is, what does the protagonist want? This is like a note they've got in their pocket. So if you have the great luck to get your script in front of one of these people and they read it and they don't find that question answered, then you're in trouble. In many ways, this is the most important thing for a writer to tackle. If readers cannot answer these questions about your protagonist, they're going to pass on your script, full stop. But if you can make them care about your character, care what happens to them, if you can make them interested in who this person is and what makes them tick and want to learn more about them, then you've won half the battle already. But if you really want to win a writing contest, then you should go a step further than this. You should actually give them an emotionally rewarding arc. If a character does not have a clear worldview expressed in the first half, then they have nowhere for their arc to go. A character arc is about a transformation of a belief, either a belief about the world in general or a belief about a character's own place in that world. K.M. Weiland calls this belief the lie that the character believes. We could also call it the flaw, something that isn't quite right, something that needs to be fine-tuned. I also have a video about character arcs. I highly suggest checking that one out. I get into a lot of depth on this. But the point here is that your character actually does need a flaw. If at the beginning of your story, the character is just sort of perfect, all the bad things in their life happen because of outside forces, because of other people doing things to them, then you haven't given them anything to learn. They have little room for growth or exploration. And the truth is, it might actually reveal the emotional immaturity of the writer. Now, I'm not taking shots. I've written characters like that too. We all do it, okay? But the truth is, often, we are the authors of our own suffering. This is a life lesson, not just a writing lesson. We can blame very few of our problems entirely on the outer world. So put that in your pen and write it. Okay, but even if you do all this, you have an interesting character who has a strong motivation, who has a clear worldview expressed in the first half that the story is going to challenge, so that at the end they can change the worldview. If you do all that, you can still put a wedge between the reader and your character if you skip over some crucial moments. Anytime an important decision is being made, anytime heartbreak happens, At any turning point in the story, at the act breaks, we want to be there with the protagonist to register what they're feeling, what they're going through. If we're not there and see the moment that they make big decisions and the moment that they commit to a path, we will feel like there's something wrong in the story and we're going to start to zone out. Most common note number 5, unnatural dialogue. Now, I don't mean stylized. Like, you might want stylized dialogue. This is especially true if you're writing sci-fi or fantasy or a historical thing. Get stylized. I actually encourage writers to get more stylized. But in such cases, what's important is not how unnatural or stylized the dialogue feels, but how consistent it is, how genuine and authentic it feels like the dialogue belongs to that world. But that's not really what I mean by unnatural dialogue. What I mean by unnatural dialogue is when characters speak things that the writer makes them say, not things that they would actually say. Remember, the characters will never tell each other things that they both already know. What Robert McKee in his book Story suggests you do is to dramatize exposition. What he means by that is you turn it into a verb, what they're doing in the context of the scene. Are they saying this information to guilt the other character? Or to threaten them with blackmail? Or maybe to seduce them? They could plead, they could attack. There are many, many options and ways to dramatize exposition. Never just have characters come out and just say things that the audience needs to hear. There's also a few things that are weirdly common that I see in dialogue. For example, a joke where one character will say something like, "Oh, you're my favorite niece." And the other character says something like, "But auntie, I'm your only niece." I don't know why. I see this like every 4th script. What's going on? Another cliche you'll see is a therapist scene, which is an extremely convenient scene because you tell therapists all kinds of things about your backstory. So what a convenient way to get the character's backstory into the movie. But it often comes out in this exchange. "So how you doing, protagonist?" "Oh, fine, I guess." You know, protagonist, "You've been coming here for, 3 weeks now? And you've barely told me anything about yourself. Don't you think it's about time that you open up?" "All right, therapist, you win. My parents beat me." You get the idea. Don't do it. Another problem I see way too often is an over-reliance on phone calls and text messaging. 9 times out of 10, when I see a phone call and there's characters on other sides of the line, my first question is there any way this could not be a phone call? In a movie especially, but maybe also in a book, it's way more interesting to have characters in the same physical space with each other because you can use the environment around them. There could be other characters who come and go. You can have blocking. You can actually turn it into a dynamic scene. The same goes for texting. And now I know if you're writing a story that takes place in the present day, then it's going to be hard not to incorporate new media and texting in some way. But I just want to remind you that it sucks to read that. And it sucks to see it in a movie too. Like, I go to a movie to see this big screen to get away from this tiny little phone I stare at all day. I don't want to look up at this big screen and see someone staring at a little phone. I'm supposed to like read the little text on the screen. Just find a different way to communicate that. Find a different way for the scene to unfold. Number 6, and this is a big one, sloppy presentation. Now, some of you are going to want to skip over this part because you're like, yeah, I got someone who proofreads my work, so I don't need to worry about that. Wrong. Now, I'm not just talking about typos and grammatical errors here, although too many of those will really make your script look like you didn't put the effort in. A few of those, no one cares. But that's not what I'm talking about here. What I'm talking about is what I'd like to call writing quality. Writing quality can encompass many things, but I'm going to give you a bunch of examples right now. Long paragraphs. So screenplays are different than novels. Duh, I know, but like a lot of writers don't realize this. The purpose of screenplay format, the reason screenplay format is the way it is because we're trying to approximate one page equaling 1 minute of screen time. But the format doesn't guarantee that. You also have to write in a certain way to achieve that. If you fill a huge paragraph with description of an environment that you can take in at a moment's glance, then all of a sudden, 1 page of screenplay is no longer 1 minute. It's more like 12 seconds. Something to keep in mind. Paragraphs that are 4 or 5 lines long are already too long. That's well above average. They start to slow down the read. They clutter the page. They mire us in details. But I often see paragraphs that are 8, 9, 10 lines long. Like I said before, readers are trying to get through a lot of scripts. This is their job. When they come across a paragraph like this, most readers will read the first couple words and then skip it. And you do not want to give the reader any reason to skip any part of your script. B, over description. We don't need everything described to us in a screenplay. Not even in a novel, but definitely not in a screenplay. It's okay to just call it a chair. It's a chair. Do I need to describe the leather? Do I need to describe the loud noise it makes? Maybe, if it's an interesting aspect of the scene. But it's okay to just call it a chair. In a novel, it might be interesting to take a moment to appreciate the damage that's been done to the upholstery, or maybe there's scratch marks that reveal that the owner once had a cat. Or maybe you can find just the right word for the right shade of beige that it is. It's just a chair. If you want to lend more personality and flair, I highly recommend you don't just load up more adjectives, that you just choose one really resonant noun. So maybe instead of a chair, you call it a chaise. That already communicates something about the chair. You don't need to say anything else. I got it. C, this is a big one, directing on the page. Now here, I don't just mean talking about camera direction, although a lot of writers do that. Conventional wisdom is that that's a bad idea, at least for the script that you're submitting to a contest. You want to remove all of that, even if you have it in your own notes and your own imagination, because you want the reader that you're sending this to just get immersed in the story and the characters. You don't want them to be imagining what the camera crew is doing. You want them to be imagining what the characters are doing. However, I don't just mean camera direction. I also mean the direction of the actors. Way too often, writers direct the actors on the page. Writers love to fill in just a simple dialogue scene with detail about the business the characters are doing, the sort of gestures they're doing with their hands, or if their voices get louder, or if they do a kind of facial expression, or whatever the blocking is going on. Leave all of that off the page. Maybe leave a touch of it here and there, especially if it actually relates to how the scene unfolds. So if at one point a character goes over there and then opens those blinds and reveals a surprise birthday party behind there, yeah, you might want to mention that the character's walking over there. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is he stares intently. Just give me the dialogue. I don't need to know that. You want to leave some space for your collaborators. And by that I mean your director, your actors, but even your reader, to fill in the scene with their own imagination. This one overlaps with the next one, which is D, parenthetical abuse. Not parental abuse, parenthetical abuse. Often writers will use the parentheses that's between the dialogue tag and the line of dialogue itself as a place to direct the actors, or sneak in adverbs, or just add a bunch of stuff that doesn't need to be there. Like sometimes, yes, if it's describing who in the scene is being addressed, or maybe if it's being whispered so that other characters can't hear. Yeah, I grant you that makes sense. But an example of something you do not need to put in parentheticals is the word angrily. Especially if the line of dialogue is something like, "I'm angry at you, you stupid bitch." It's just more clutter on the page. And all it does is box your actor in to one interpretation of that line of dialogue. You have to understand the actor's work. What an actor does when they get a line and when they read a scene is they're going to come to you with some ideas of what the character's motivation is in the scene, or where in the scene the motivation might change. If you box them in to one reading, that's going to limit their own imagination. Let them have free rein. See what they bring to you. They might give you 3 different interpretations of how the scene could be played, none of which are how you imagined it was played. And probably all 3 of them are better. Number E, letter E, lack of question marks in dialogue. Why is everyone doing this? This is weirdly common. There'll be a question, but it ends in a period. Now, I get it. Maybe you're trying to make it sort of like a blunt or a toneless question, but it's actually just a grammatical error. The reader most often doesn't read it that way. They look at that and they go, "Where's the question mark?" Just grow up and put your question marks back in your questions, okay? Thank you. F, character names in all caps. This one is just simply a mistake and it needs to be corrected. Characters have their names in all caps the first time they're introduced, the first time they appear in a script, and no other time. The reason for this is extremely simple. It's not only to signal to the reader when a character is being introduced. It says, hey, this is a new character, pay attention to them. But also the opposite. It signals to a reader when a character has already been introduced. So if they forget who that character is, then they know they've messed up. And maybe they'll go into the search bar and search that character's name and go, oh yeah, they were introduced earlier. Shit, why did I forget that? So many writers, for some reason, capitalized characters' names in the dialogue itself where it implies that it's being shouted. Don't do it. G, overuse of exclamation marks and all caps. Now, someone said once you have one exclamation mark you can use in your novel. That's pretty stingy, but it's actually pretty good advice. Consider it. I think it goes all the more so for all caps. And we're talking about dialogue here. I think it's even truer when we're talking about descriptions. When the writer uses exclamation marks and all caps just for emphasis, just for, it's an exciting part and they want the reader to understand it's exciting, it's a little cheap. It's a little ham-fisted. Okay? It's a little on the nose. On the nose. H, passive voice. Why ever say the table was overturned when you could say Hercules overturned the table? So much better. I, the use of first or second person. Now, you really often see the pronoun we in screenplay descriptions. Sometimes you'll see you, like, you could imagine that. Not as often, but they're both a problem in my view. Not everyone agrees on the we thing. Some people like to use we, like, we see this. But again, with the camera direction stuff, it puts the reader in a place of imagining themselves being an audience in a movie theater watching the film, rather than placing them in the events of the film itself with the characters imagining everything unfolding before their eyes. It's just another layer of mediation. J, is and are verbs. There are very few times when it's better to say he is sitting on a couch rather than he sits on a couch, or she is driving down a road when you could say she drives down a road, or they are eating hamburgers when you could just say they eat hamburgers. Remember, the verb is the engine of the sentence. Choose the most vivid, immediate, accurate, and expressive verb you can find. Is and are, not that good verb. They're not that good verbs, okay? Instead of he sits, what about he lounges or he sprawls? Not she drives down the road, but she blasts down the road. Not they eat hamburgers, but they stuff their faces, okay? Find interesting verbs. That's what writing's all about. Okay, you're gonna love this one. Telling, not showing. I know, you've heard this a million times in 100 different contexts, but I'm talking about a specific context here with regards to screenplay descriptions. So many writers tell the reader information directly in the descriptions rather than dramatizing it or putting it in dialogue. This often happens in character descriptions. When the character first appears and you get a nice little description of them, sometimes writers take that as an excuse to give a life story of the character. They might write something that you'd put like on a acting breakdown or something that you'd tell your actor about the character's backstory. But it doesn't belong in the script necessarily. Like they'll say something like, John steps into the room. He's 6'4" and he's actually worth $1 million even though you wouldn't guess it from the greasy overalls he's wearing. That's not how screenplays work. Screenplays are about concrete images. Just tell me about the overalls, not his bank account. Unless I'm looking at his bank account. Don't tell me about it. Don't tell me about this character's $1 million smile unless she's smiling right now. Don't tell me about her 3 kids unless her 3 kids come running into the room right now. Always keep us in the present moment. Descriptions are never the place to tell the reader about the character's thoughts, the character's backstory, smells. Why do I see so many screenwriters writing about smells? When's the last time you smelled something in a movie? Have you seen a movie before? Or the passage of time. If you just say 3 hours later they did this. How are you going to communicate it's 3 hours later? Okay, do we see a whole bunch of empty coffee cups on the desk? That signifies that the characters had 4 coffees? Or do you notice the clock has moved and that signifies the passage of time? Or maybe the character's beard has grown and that signifies the passage of time. Whatever it is, you have to illustrate it in the image. You have to communicate it in cinematic terms. You can't just write it in the description and hope that somehow the director will communicate that. Your job as a screenwriter is to translate abstract ideas into concrete images. So long as you're still giving us abstract ideas in language, you're not doing your job. Number 7, I just have some overall advice to say goodbye. Look, I know it's really easy to look out at the landscape of media and think, wow, mediocre goes. Everyone's looking for mediocre. Mediocre does well. Mediocre wins awards. So why can't I just write something that's, pretty good, better than mediocre even? Why can't that be good enough? You might think like, hey, if scripts like that can get made, then why can't my pretty good script get made? Nope. Don't think that way. Stop yourself from thinking that way. You're giving in to the suck. You're empowering the suck. We are artists. We must fight against the suck. Don't give up until it's good. Know exactly what you're going for and settle for nothing less than that. The bottom line here is that writing is not like laying track. This is how laying track works. You put down some track, and then you put down some more, and then you put down some more, and then you put down some more, and then you get to your destination. The end. Nope, that's not how writing works. Writing is more like sculpture. And I am not a sculptor. I don't know that much about sculpture. But one thing I do know about sculpture is that it works by subtraction. If you're working with marble, you need to have a big slab of marble in front of you. And then you need to remove carefully parts of that marble to reveal a form that is in there somewhere. Even if you're working with clay, you might still actually add things, right? But you still need a bunch of clay in front of you to start shaping it. Think of a first draft, not as laying down track, but rather as slapping a bunch of marble on the table, or clay on the table. And then the next drafts, and I say drafts, plural, because you got to go through many drafts, is the long, slow process of actually finding it. You have to find, it's in there somewhere. You have to find it. The worst thing I see as a reader is when I get a new draft of a script I've read before, and it's almost the same. Maybe they cut a couple scenes, they added one thing, changed a character's name, transformed some dialogue. That's the same script. As writers, we need to be much braver than that. You need to consider bigger, global, conceptual changes. I like to think of George Lucas, and if you know a little bit about the drafting process for the original script for Star Wars, it went through some major changes. He did a page 1 rewrite, not once, not twice, but many times. And these weren't just small changes. He was combining characters together. He was transforming the entire plot. He went from having 7 plans to 3 or something like that. The point here is that if you just agonize over small details, you're never going to find what lays inside of that marble. This is why my favorite writing advice I've ever heard comes from John Locke in season 1 of Lost.
Ludovico Buonarroti, Michelangelo's father. He was a wealthy man, had no understanding of the divinity in his son, so he beat him. No child of his was going to use his hands for a living, so Michelangelo learned not to use his hands. Years later, a visiting prince came into Michelangelo's studio and found the master staring at a single 18-foot block of marble. Then he knew the rumors were true that Michelangelo had come in every day for the past 4 months, stared at the marble, and gone home for his supper. So the prince asked the obvious, "What are you doing?" And Michelangelo turned around and looked at him and whispered, "Sto lavorando. I'm working." Three years later, that block of marble was the statue of David.
That's all for now. Thanks for watching this unnecessarily long video. I hope it's useful to you. I hope it's inspiring to you. Let me know what you're working on, and if anything here is helpful, or if you disagree, I want to hear that too. There's my dog Poe. Follow for more videos like this, and I love you all. Let's make out.